Perhaps the most challenging aspect of systems governance is the sixth principle of human behaviour. And it's a challenge because it's often dealt with as a separate subject and not integrated with the other five, not integrated with the system, and often dealt with by itself. Not often enough do people stop to think about the symbiosis of the people and the technology that actually make up the system. And so that the people aspects are dealt with not only as a separate issue, but often as something after the fact. So you can see that in front of us there is a significantly long agenda of areas we need to consider when it comes to human behaviour in relation to systems governance. Too often people have considered that human behaviour is to be dealt with by way of training people how to use a system. But by then it's often too late. People at the early stage needed to look at that responsibility aspect, the RACI matrix, to understand what was, for example, working and not working in the business processes. Otherwise, all you tend to do is to automate old things which don't work well in the first place, rather than taking the opportunity of using technology and people in symbiosis to make things better. Whatever fuel we put into our systems governance activities, it will be people who will be guiding the overall direction of a system, the evaluation of its objectives and the ideas on how to implement a system and what can make a system better, the direction of those ideas and the monitoring of what's working and what isn't, so that change can be made which is effective and efficient, and all of those other non-functional requirements that actually exist in the background and await to be defined before a single element of functionality is really identified. This sixth principle of human behaviour in our systems governance framework boils down to two parts, very simply, to make sure that we consider human factors throughout the life cycle of a system, and that the work practices on how technology is implemented and integrated and its use is appropriate and thought out in terms of how people will respond to it. It comes down to remembering that any one of our six principles is not a fire and forget stage. It's a constant cycle where any principle may have to be revisited at any time. As our strategy develops and our architecture and what that will look like, we may reallocate responsibilities. We may find new ways and better ways to test, which may again actually reflect responsibilities. How we acquire our systems, how we measure its performance, and how we integrate human behaviour. Lessons will be learned at our different stages. But the earlier in the life cycle we get this balance, so we get this rhythm in place, the better. Let's just take a moment to dispel one of the greatest myths which is holding back the symbiosis of people and technology. This is an often distributed cartoon, but we've made a slight change because the character in the corner, Dave, is labelled as user error. And this is really rather unfair because there's no such thing as user error, it's just people being human. And we understand these principles and we understand these aspects. So we ought to be programming and designing and dealing for that so that the people and the technology work together. Perhaps the most overused and unreasonable request that we expect of people using our systems is telling them not to click on suspicious links, making them the front line of our defences, whereas actually we should be combining that with the transshipment of what's coming in, the passing of what is expected in terms of clicking on a particular link, making that safe, the segmentation of a system so that if somebody was to do so, it might be done in a sandbox, or at the very least will not have that problem of contagion across the system. But we don't do this. We leave it and we continually put out this message, a message which is expected to be taken to heart by somebody at every moment of every working day whilst they are under pressure to deliver whatever they need to do from their job. On the whole, I think it's fair to say that people do not come to work expecting to do a bad job. They just want to get the work done, and they will look for the easiest ways of doing so. So, while we're at the 6th principle of systems governance, we must look back through the others and focus on responsibility, the allocation of decision rights and escalation paths across our RACI matrix, across the life cycle of the system, to make sure that it can operate, and that is encompassed in the protection and the self-preservation of that system against bad things happening which might put at risk the desirable outcomes of the system. For security governance, any aspect of governance, the core is remembering the importance that the system has to do what is required of it to deliver the desirable outcomes, its desirable operations, and taking into account the feedback from that system to keep it on track, to put the protective measures in place, and to be able to react accordingly to any kind of attack, anything that which threatens, for example, in security terms, the confidentiality, integrity and availability of that system. The place of the people and the technology, of how they interact and how they interoperate and what controls which aspect of the system will vary from device to person and system to system. It may be something big. It may be industrial processes as opposed to plain data processing and number crunching to get some sort of financial report. It might be the almost carried in the hand brain that we have in terms of our mobile computing devices that also make telephone calls. There's also the peripheral things which react with larger systems, just collect data, the sensors, and we react and adjust our behaviours similarly as we might expect systems to behave and adjust as well. Then we're looking in the future perhaps at different levels of control, different levels of symbiosis between the peoples and the machines, to such a stage that we get to that singularity where actually we can't discern where one begins and the other ends. But perhaps for now we still need to remember that for as long as we can predict that what will govern the direction that we go in will often be the finances. As we race ahead with our ideas, we need governance to govern, to control, to dampen, to steer and direct what we're doing with our systems, so that the ideas that we come up with are in line with the objectives. And this is why the human aspect needs to be considered all the way through the life cycle, not just in the final use of the system, because all of those constraints and temptations that we might be considering in terms of the end users are also going to affect the people in the development and the management and the delivery of the systems in the first place. As well as all the things that we can do to steer our systems towards desirable outcomes and increase the risk of success. So we also need to be aware of the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities and susceptibilities of our stakeholders and the technologies and the people involved in the symbiosis of the people and the technologies together. They're things that have to be dealt with together to ensure a degree of trustworthiness. Not everything will be able to be overcome, but we should be able to compensate with one for the other. Our systems need to be able to operate and deliver on their expectations and the requirements. We need to build in the protection, and they need to be able to adapt to dangerous situations, difficult situations, so that they continue to be trustworthy in the eyes of those who have a stake. So again, we need to return to that racy matrix, because there will be some people who can guide and some people who will only live in the thrall of the systems we deliver. Human behaviour is not just about the system in use. It's about how the system is built and the racy aspects, the decision rights and the escalation paths throughout its life cycle in relation to how it's delivered and the changes to those aspects too. A key thing to note from this principle of human behaviour is that training is not just something about the users and the final system. It's about making sure that people are adequately trained to develop and deliver the system in the first place. Without such a focus, we risk the system being imbalanced and expecting the training of those end users to compensate for mistakes and inadequacies in the development of the system earlier on. The more we pay attention to this, then we can build on the talents of people and support them with the opportunities in the technology. Despite the allocation of decision rights and escalation paths, it can often still be difficult to find the common vocabularies necessary between different stakeholders. It may be relatively easy to define the operational principles, the functionality of the system, but what may be more difficult are the non-functional requirements like security. So it's useful to have frameworks like this system software product quality set to be able to identify at least what needs to be discussed. And importantly, with those decision rights, what needs to be decided upon as well. There's an increasing body of literature which recognises that it's rather lazy to blame a problem with a system on human error, where human error tends to be just one component. In fact, it's probably wrong to call it human error at all. It's just people being human. I mean, there are deliberate acts of stupidity and willful negligence and bloody-mindedness and evil, but on the whole, this is not the way that we expect people to behave, and we can rely on most people to be good. But systems design must support the good and be able to compensate for the bad. It has to ride the crest with whatever activities are actually going on, which is when all of those elements of protection actually flip to become those of self-preservation and to react and adapt and to steer the system towards the desirable outcomes, which may be very specific in a security situation. People have to have the support so that they can help themselves, which is not just a matter of the system as it's developed, but also the system as it's in use and the way that people will expect people to use it in terms of their workloads and shifts and what might actually be expected from the reasonable delivery of a piece of work. People are just as much a part of the system as the technology. So the challenge is to get that balance right, to achieve that symbiosis, so that sometimes the decision rights actually may be in the delivery of the parts of the system, rather than the actual people making the decisions, because the decisions are pre-programmed into the system at its development stage. this becomes more complex and more opportunistic and in terms of what we might be able to do, and adapt systems and develop systems which take advantage of machine learning. But we need to make sure that they don't run off by themselves without getting that additional knowledge, experience and human intervention which makes sure that our system remains on track and keeps in with those objectives which were the benchmark against which the whole existence and any change to the system are actually governed by. Cyber attacks come in many different forms and may be perpetrated by nation states or just common criminals. The outcomes of elections could be interfered with. The way organisations work could be disrupted or brought to a halt. They may be used to gain intelligence for other attacks, which may be cyber or perhaps might be more physical in nature. They may disrupt power supplies and industrial complexes. They may be used for revenge. They may be used as shortcuts so that people can acquire complicated technology which other people put the investment and years into design and others reap the benefits from. It might just be taking cash. It might be taking information to allow people to gain cash from other people. Or it might be to find out what is being done to keep people safe. Because it's not just a matter of data protection anymore. We should look on cybersecurity as preventing online harms. We might not be able to prevent all of them, but at least we should be able to help people to recover. Governance is the great opportunity and also the greatest risk. It's where people can be tempted to try and rely on technology or rely on people. But when you get the balance right, then governance is where you actually can steer the system in terms of whether it's human interaction which is needed or machine interaction or a combination of the two. And these may be decisions made because of speed or resources, but they're carefully balanced decisions made in a evaluate, direct and monitor type of cycle. Teamwork is core to cybersecurity, to be able to get a good picture of the threats which may turn into risks which threaten the state of our cyber and information security on our systems. Bringing together people from different backgrounds and with different specialist knowledge will help us to amalgamate the variety of knowledge which is required to build our systems as they model and reflect what we might term the real world. Some of this will be well known to us. We'll have some general idea perhaps of the accounting or perhaps even some of the technical specialities of the technology which we have to connect our systems to for control. But where we may be expert in information technology, it's likely we'll have to call on legal or engineering expertise. This may be unknown to us, but it's well known to others. Where we may be challenged is understanding just how wide asking we need to go to bring in this specialist knowledge. And there will be times when it's only after implementation of a system that we have to go through the expensive business of bringing in external expertise and correcting it because we didn't realise it at the time. Hopefully, projects will learn from these mistakes and improve, or indeed we can learn from the mistakes of other projects and understand where they went wrong so that we can put it right. The most challenging area is that of emergence, where new things combine to cause challenges which nobody had predicted. Dual use of a technology is often an example of this. But if we keep this quadrant in mind, we can reduce those unknown unknowns to an absolute minimum and be able to deal with the surprise events. So even if we don't know that they're coming, we have a process in place to be resilient and to be able to recover and correct accordingly. Our principle of human behaviour is not about just letting that lie or letting us ride upon it. It's about building it in right from the first principles. It's about involvement in terms of the racy matrix. It's about the system in use and working with people to have that constant improvement and availability to learn as a result and to do away with bad habits. And this is why, although important, training is only one element of dealing with human behaviour. The better the design of the system, the less training people have to go through. Governance is such a great term because it has its origins in engineering in the same way that we might govern and control and dampen a system in terms of feedback to it to make sure that it stays on the right path or within the right tolerances and limits. This also describes how we need to handle our information systems. We want to be able to have some control over the entire behaviour of the system so that it gives us the desirable outcomes. This will be a balance of the technology behaviour, but also the human behaviour as well, the user behaviour when the system's in use. We may well know what their capability is. We may well know what the opportunity is for the system to deliver those desirable outcomes, those ones which match the objectives. The challenge is to make sure that the motivation of the users, part of the system, is kept in check and on balance and focused towards doing the right thing. So this means being able to understand what behaviours can be encouraged by the right kinds of motivation. When we studied performance, we discussed the idea of looking at how a system is getting on, what it's actually doing and how we're measuring that, and looking at those measures on the dials so that we'd know which levers to pull to make sure that those measurements stay within an acceptable range. Similarly, with behaviours, there are ways that we can manage and look to see that these behaviours are going to be appropriate and make sure that the capabilities and the opportunities and the motivation drives people towards acting appropriately and they're part of the system. The behaviour change wheel actually gives us a rich toolbox of different things that we can use, some of which will be built into the system to elicit particular responses. Others might be more external in terms of rewards and the like, to motivate people in terms of getting something for what they do and arriving at the right place. The behaviour change wheel gives us the tools to combine with the technology to steer the human reaction, the human behaviour of our system, to give the system the overall characteristics and adaptability that we want it to have. Using this behavioural modification as a technique across the system allows it to be adaptive to different situations. But this isn't just about the end users. It's throughout the life cycle of the system, throughout the supply chain of the people who bring the system together and deliver its services. So looking at this from a slightly negative point of view, the message here is to stop dumping risk on the end users by expecting to be able to train them and for them to cope with what are essentially flaws in the overall system. It's the responsibility of the owners to set forth the infrastructure in place in terms of the way that systems are built, maintained, managed and operated. that the actors do their bit to sustain their responsibilities to be able to deliver, that the system will make those transformations within the worldview that the system is meant to rest upon. But there is that constant awareness, that situational awareness, so that the system can adapt to changing situations. And those needs to adapt and change the system are taken into account through our cycle of governance, where we evaluate these opportunities. We will then direct accordingly and monitor those opportunities and changes that we are trying to balance up. So here we are at this sixth principle of systems governance, and we're looking all the way back to our first principle of responsibility, as we make sure that the human behavioural elements are contemplated all the way through the life cycle of our system, and that the responsibilities for that are well assigned, and it takes into account all of the various personalities and people and roles and responsibilities that we will have understood in our RACI matrix. Governance is there to move away from any concept that technology is about development and installation and then forgetting about it. It's about the interaction, about what changes need to be made, what needs to be updated on a regular basis. It's about the collaboration and cooperation across supply chains, externally and internally too. Governance can learn a lot from the art of business continuity planning, where organisations will try to understand what can go wrong, often from a particularly catastrophic viewpoint, and they'll plan for these particular incidents and what to do when they occur. However, they can follow so many different paths. The chances are that the detail in the plan that they put together may be of very little use when that catastrophe strikes, because it won't quite work as predicted, or other things will change. But the very fact that people have gone through that planning process, so that the first time that they talk and communicate with each other is not in a state of crisis, is absolutely priceless for the organisation. And those relationships being built up before there are problems, built up under a positive aspect, is extremely valuable. And this sets the tone for governance too. So where do these decision rights end and the escalation paths begin? Where are the changes made to make sure that the system adapts to a different situation as it develops? Is this a situation which is close to business as usual? Or are we facing a catastrophic failure potential as a result of an attack? These are all the questions which need to be contemplated, and they will be different for different systems. Whether these are systems for crunching numbers and delivering reports, whether they directly interact with machinery, for example, or very intimate devices like insulin pumps or pacemakers. It may be our day-to-day personal management on our mobile phones, or the data coming back from our health gadgetry. We may get to the stage where we have implants, and we already do, those who already have to manage and are blessed with the capabilities of pacemakers and the other medical devices that have been mentioned. And how far will we actually go? Well, the future will tell. The standards and good practice that we have around us give us the body of knowledge for the controls that we can put in place to steer our systems. And it's important that we learn those lessons, only make new mistakes, so that we work in a regime of continuous improvement. This takes us back to our governance standard from the International Standards Organization 38500, and its active engine of collecting the great ideas, the innovation, and making sure that that innovation does not become disruption for all the wrong reasons. Remembering that we are taking a focus on security when we're looking at governance and its application across a systems and its systems life cycle, then look at the standard, again a collection of distilled good practice numbered 27001, where controls for security are listed. These are the ones which you can build into your systems, the people and the technology aspects, to achieve a degree of security according to the risks that you face. Again, it's governance, making sure that the lessons learned previously are carried forward. Although training is only one component of the system's life cycle and its delivery of the system and the implementation of the system, it is still an important one. And this is where we rejoin the challenges of measuring performance, of how we measure the performance of our system in terms of security, and particularly in terms of the people aspect. Although for a record-keeping point of view and making sure that everybody gets their training, for example, it's important to be able to maintain those records of who has had the appropriate training for their use of the system. However, that number of how many people have been trained is unlikely to be a really useful guide to how secure your system is. Like other components we've discussed, security training is not a fire and forget event. It's a constant activity, being able to deliver that training either directly through the system or through training courses. These have to be appropriate, and one must be careful not to make it a tick box exercise, but people understand its importance and how it affects their job. So it's integrated with what their responsibilities are, rather than being just something else that they have to get on and do. It may well be that we can see that we've got the balance of our systems technology and our systems people aspects correct by assessing people's attitude to security and risk, and to see whether we've put the technical controls in which matches that attitude. And we can perhaps improve people's approach by that attention to making sure that not only have they got the capability, but they also have the motivation to improve their behaviours and to keep their behaviours in line with the expectations of the threat landscape. So that's our sixth principle of systems governance, that of human behaviour and how it forms an integral part of the other 5 components and an integral part of our systems themselves. It's not separate, but it integrates with the technology, or should do, and that's the challenge of governance. If you have any questions, please take them to the discussion board so that everyone can benefit.